This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Exvangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. I've got another great author interview for you today featuring a conversation with Timothy Morton, who's the author of several books, including the most recent book, Hell, in Search of a Christian Ecology. Timothy is actually a late-in-life convert to Christianity after spending decades exploring things like Buddhism and other philosophies, and Timothy's prior work in a book called Hyperobjects was very helpful in my own writing and development of my manuscript, and we'll get to that in the interview. But this is a very interesting story and delves very much into Timothy's personal life, as it does have a lot of memoir qualities to the book. I do want to highlight, as part of that, Timothy does talk frankly about child abuse and child sex abuse, as well as complex PTSD. So if any of those topics are a trigger for you, please be aware that they are part of this conversation. This is a longer conversation. It's closer to 90 minutes, and I usually have a light editorial touch. So there's only been some things like repeated words and some other things like that taken out using a service called Descript. So if you do have any comments about the editorial aspect of things or about how the show is developed, I do have, again, a lighter editorial touch just based on my own resources at this time. I did recently receive a review that highlighted this. It said, and gave me 4 stars and said it was a really good resource, and said that I bring in good speakers and stories. But that being said, I'm not a journalist, and it can sometimes be a tough listen with a lot of repeating and filler words. I am really trying to adjust that as best I can. So I wanted to flag that comment and feedback, and just to let you know that I am doing what I am able to do with the resources I have, which right now is this AI editing software, Descript. I cannot currently afford a producer to professionally edit the show. So if you do want to help me make this a better sounding show with that type of development, please go over to post-evangelicalpost.com and support the show directly. You can do that for $5 a month or $50 a year, and you get links to ad-free podcast feeds and other things like that. So thank you for that feedback. If you want to leave your own review or rating, please go over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else that you can leave ratings for the show. Those things do help, and I do read them. So thank you very much. If you want to get in contact with me, you can email me at contact@exvangelicalpodcast.com and subscribe over to the Post-Evangelical Post, which you will see links to in the show notes. This has already been a long preamble, but I do want to mention one other thing that I'm very humbled and grateful for, which is that my book that is coming out in September, Exvangelical and Beyond, just recently received a starred review from Kirkus Reviews. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. That is such a great honor to have received that, and I'm very excited for that. You can also find a link to pre-order the book in the show notes as well. All right, let's get into it. My guest today is Timothy Morton. They are Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English at Rice University and Director of the Cool America Foundation and author of more than 20 books, including Hyperobjects, Dark Ecology, and Ecology Without Nature. Their most recent book, Hell, in Search of a Christian Ecology, was published this May. Timothy, welcome to the show.
Gosh, Blake, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm really very excited to talk to you about your work. I read a Wired profile about you while writing my own manuscript, and it really threw me for a loop and actually helped reframe my thinking considerably, but we'll get to that in a little bit.
Oh, gosh.
Your most recent book explores your surprising conversion to Christianity, something that seems to have even surprised you after decades of exploring Buddhism and other philosophies. But let's start where your book does, which is with your childhood in England. Christianity seemed to be a part of your schooling, but your home life was decidedly anti-Christian. So how did that affect your initial relationship to Christianity and just the process of growing up?
Sure, Blake. Well, you see, so one thing I wanted to make clear, so I became aware of this wonderful word that you've been developing, Exvangelical, through the process of writing this book. It wasn't until rather towards the end of writing the book that I became aware of it. I beg your pardon, listeners, because this is a show where people think about this for a lot, very profoundly. But what's interesting is, despite what was just said about converting, I think I accidentally wrote a book for you guys. And not only that, there are people in Britain now doing the reverse,
Mm-hmm.
surprisingly. There are some people in Britain who are getting into the Christianity. And so I think, cross fingers, this book provides sort of off ramps for people, but also on ramps for people in
Mm-hmm.
some way. And to that point, I would just like to say, I can't talk to what it's like being in a toxic religion environment as a kid, but I sort of can actually, because one thing that you learn in the book, which is very memoir-like, because I had to kind of dredge a lot of things out to kind of write it,
Mm-hmm.
is that I grew up with a father who was a psychopath. Yeah. Now, of course, the sort of vanilla picture of God as mostly a psychopath in the skies, mostly white, mostly psychopathic, who mostly wants to hurt you. Despite the fact that my father was very sort of seemingly anti-religious in content, as it were, the way he was my dad was extremely like that,
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, so not only was he psychopathic, he was very abusive, sexually abusive, and otherwise, and was connected to, and this is the crazy bit. See, so I wrote this memoir that was all about supposedly inanimate objects, and it was called The Stuff of Life. And halfway through, I was like, oh, what a relief! I don't have to talk about the real stuff with the people. And then I had this mega surgery, and it was reset my whatever that is. I like to say soul these days for some reason. It kind of reset my being.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that I could write and that I ought to write, that I must write about this, right? And so I sort of set to writing about it. And I realized through the process of writing it that, um, you know, even I have found it hard to believe my childhood. I really started to know what had happened to me kind of in plain sight in about 2018. That is 6 years before we're recording this, Blake,
Mm-hmm.
after 24 years of psychoanalysis. Now, you would have thought that, you could figure this stuff out, but actually it takes a long time to really see it, even or possibly especially if it's hiding in plain sight. And then I realized, wow, I have complex PTSD, and also therefore I need to go into EMDR therapy for a few years, right? And so I've done a lot of work to figure this out. And if anybody's listening to this who's in a kind of space where they're feeling like really upset or confused, or, did this really happen to me? And then, wow, it really did, all the sort of complicated feelings that you can have. I
Mm-hmm.
just want to let you know it's really okay to be incredibly bewildered right now. If you've just left a huge abusive structure such as a church, then, it's okay to be very bewildered.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And like along with upset, what happened, you know? And it, what, I don't know whether you eat ice cream, but this is the time where you could buy a massive tub of it and just eat it straight out of the thing. Just don't even worry about anything. Just give yourself some kind of niceness
Right.
in your life. So anyway, yeah, the closest thing I had to religious. So what you got to realize is that my father was also connected to the London underworld, right? Not the underground, like the tube system, or indeed the druggy world, which was more like he was connected to that world, but you could sort of call it the demi-monde, but he was actually also connected to these people called the Cray twins, who were like the London mafia.
Wow.
And, they were in the business of making child pornography, which I got into. I figured this all out later, right? Like I had to reverse engineer all kinds of things from some stuff that little fragments, right? And talking about it with people and stuff. It's just like this crazy thing. And so even I find it hard to believe it. When these memories were first hitting me, it was like my thumbs would reach for the iPhone to write it down. And in the time it took me to have the memory and get my thumbs to write it down, I would forget. to me, right? And I had to do that like over and over with some of these things, right? So
Mm.
I don't blame yourself if you're having trouble putting the jigsaw together. It's really okay for the jigsaw to be really sort of shattered for a bit. The other thing to know is that, funnily enough, and this is going to make you smile, hopefully. So a crime family, not the Biden crime, that's just an illusion, right? A real crime family is incredibly moralistic. Like the closest thing to like a big religious group that I can think of would be a crime family, actually, because the rigid sense of right and wrong, above and beyond any kind of genuine moral code, is intense, right? Like, I couldn't even think about certain kinds of music without being hugely teased, abused, disrespected. Like, then that's just the art, right? I wasn't allowed to sing certain things. I wasn't allowed to say certain things. All my brothers were turned against me. Like, the whole thing was to do with enforcing some kind of extremely, to use a perhaps provocative word, primitive morality, where there's a absolutely black and white division between right and wrong. There's no ambiguity at all.
And this was
So
enforced,
interesting.
and this was enforced by the criminal aspect of this being
Yeah, yeah. I think
of having a uniformity.
there's one of my favorite films is Deep Cover, yeah, with Larry Fishburne, and he goes into deep cover as a coke dealer in the early '90s, right? And he's being trained to do this, and the chief of police is like, you score like a criminal on your psych evaluation, and one of the things you score highly on, you have a very strict moral code, but no sense of right and wrong,
Ah,
right? Like, so
yeah,
you're very rigid. And but for you, it's all about rewarding and punishing, right? It's all about the basic sort of stuff of life, right? Like the real stuff of life, like the emotional stuff, the stuff that might not even be emotional. It's like sort of quasi physical. It's the thing that is named in the word narcissism, right? Like, guy who was in charge before Biden had a disordered narcissism, but any life form has a boundary which is more or less permeable. And any life form is confronted with this question of, what do I let in and what do I exclude, right?
hmm,
Inclusion versus exclusion. And I am a great believer in a lot of the things of Freud, right? And one of the things that he says that I agree with, unfortunately, groups of human beings are narcissists unless you work on them really hard. Yeah. And I was in group psychoanalysis for like 8 years, and I really thought, oh my gosh, that was so difficult
mm,
being there, because it's just like 8 people sitting in a room and that's it, right? Like, whoa, and the inclusion versus exclusion vibe is so primordial,
yeah,
right? And fascism is made out of it, right? Fascism is made out of including people in the fascist gang, right? Which is basically a criminal gang. The word fascism comes from the Latin fasces, which is a bundle of
hmm,
sticks, right? And these
hmm,
sticks are weak on their own, but they're strong in the sort of bunch,
right,
right? So the whole idea is to be in this bunch. You don't mean anything unless you're in this gang. Everything else gets excluded, right? It's this basic primordial stuff, right? And groups are that, unfortunately, unless you really work on them. So very unfortunately, people, fascism is the default, or maybe, in an earlier age, it's tyranny. I don't know how correlated to capitalism it is, but some kind of tyranny is the default. You've got to work on it really hard for it
hmm,
not to be. And so I don't blame anybody who's just left a fundamentally narcissistically disordered massive group for feeling really strange, because there's nothing like a massive group
right,
to make you feel teeny, teeny, tiny. The
yeah,
closest I came to it actually was on a retreat, a Buddhist retreat in the Rocky Mountains in the late 90s. There were 400 people up there, and they were all falling in love with this guru. Yeah. And I wasn't, along with one of my good friends. Right.
mm,
And the group pressure, yeah, to conform was so immense that I kind of lost my mind, right? And I actually lost my mind so much that when I got back down off the mountain and went into my little group therapy session, which I'd missed for a few months, I behaved spontaneously really badly to the people in that group. And I didn't even know. I thought I
hmm,
was being funny, but I'd been so messed around by just a few weeks of this crazy living Stanford prison experiment, right? That I was just like all over the place. So like, don't blame yourself if your coordinates, if your ethical, aesthetic, anything, psychological coordinates are all over the place right now. It's really
right,
okay. You
yeah,
just left an incredibly powerful, abusive structure that I am familiar with in a different way, thoughts from my early childhood.
Right. Yeah. That, I mean, there's so many interesting connections between that pressure to conformity, that um, to use more stereotypical language, like you don't go against the family type vibes that that you actually see often in even the news that comes out at a terrifyingly frequent pace about
Mm,
things like abuse scandals within churches or by pastors
hmm
who have charisma and convince people to stay
hmm
with them and to cover for them and all of those types
hmm
of things. It is fascinating to make that an explicit similarity between those different types of groups.
Yeah, for real. So this guy who was in the guru person in the Rockies turned out to be a mega Me Too people abuser and rapist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Many years later, it was like, oh, I was right then, not to want to have anything to do with it, because of course, with my trained survival mode, I've got Sherlock Holmes level kind of survival danger detection stuff going. I've got like a Dr. House level of an annoying ability to analyze situations really fast and figure out like, so there's the exit route. That's what to say. That's what not to say. I still get myself in trouble because I'm also, unfortunately, I was trained to be the scapegoat, right? If anybody feels like they're full of poison right now, like they've been poisoned, they've got all these bad thoughts inside them, right? Like that's because the group put all their bad stuff into you and then ejected you. It's like the bad side of religion, right? Like it's like let's scapegoat the bad being and like exclude it, right? Um, and I am, I'm habituated to that. I figured out a way to get paid for it, right? So I do my job is I'm a university professor in an English department, and I feel like I get paid to say the wrong thing, in public. So I published this book called Ecology Without Nature, and it's basically saying very quietly to get through the metal detector of the scholarly reader, who was inevitably one of the people I was criticizing, who's thought I was criticizing. I don't criticize people. I go after ideas. Have you ever noticed that quite a lot of environmental criticism is a bit racist and misogynistic and homophobic? I said it so quietly, like it would get published, but I still got these death threats for it, right? I got
Oh
stalked.
my.
I had to do police reports. It was heavy, and I know that energy. The trouble is I can attract it as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know borderline. I know, no, these are the technical terms, right? I have depression, but it comes and goes. If you've got a personality disorder, it's chronic. It's your world, right? It's your reality. The easiest one to treat is borderline, right? Funnily enough, psychopath is the next easiest. The worst is narcissistic.
Hmm.
That's the hardest one to treat, and it's so hard. It's so hard, like watching as people tried to do something with the previous guy, only to find that they were caught into the game. It was
Mm-hmm.
incredibly frustrating watching it because I was well aware of that kind of what did my therapist used to call it? Narcissistic aggression. Yeah, just basic envy, like envy, like not I'm jealous of you, but you have no right to exist. You
Mm.
need to be destroyed, right? And I sort of like coming to awareness as a tiny person, knowing that your dad wants to get rid of you. Oh, yeah. So
Yeah.
I so that I understand the hard bits of life. Like if you talk to me about death or despair, or you just lost somebody or whatever, I'm the person you can talk with about that. Just don't ask me to be part of a reading group or like go shopping with you because I'll go crazy. Like it's the normal stuff that blows my mind,
Mm-hmm.
as a PTSD person. And when I go through something, I'm totally calm. Like bad stuff happens, completely relaxed, you know. There was a fire in my house a few weeks ago, and the fire department were like, wow, so chill. They were patting me on the back, going, that was a miracle because you called us. Most people just rubberneck it and try to put it out because they're all freaked out, but you just went straight into. And I saw the fire. It's like, oh, what a drag. Now I have to call the fire department, and it was like survival mode, totally calm. Several days later, I freaked out,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Yeah.
in the moment, you've learned to be really together. And I'm talking about not just my father here, but so, for example, when I was about 10 years old, he introduced me to an assassin. I figured out immediately with my spidey sense that this guy was a psychopath. You could sort of see the little tiny pinprick eyes of this guy, sitting in my dad's living room. There was a Cray twins. If you've lived in London, you'll know the sort of history of these London mafia people. assassin guy in my dad's living room. So why is
Wow.
he in there? You know, because my dad's a blabbermouth and he'd done something and they were talking, he could easily talk about it, right? This guy was a feature of my childhood. Yeah, so, his name was Lofty. I never got to know his real name. So as soon as I was told that, my intelligence and my survival mode clicked, and I was like, oh, you're a psychopath. I don't want to come within 100 clicks
Wow.
of you. You know, I have a very good mad people detection, but the trouble is also, of course, I sort of spontaneously learned to attract it and make a deal with it and talk to it, rather than have like complete boundary, like, oh, you're just crazy.
Do you think that your attraction to Buddhism and the other types of treatments and philosophies that you've explored throughout your life, do you think that's an outgrowth of this survival mode, of a way of, you know, um, being cognitively addressing these types of things that might not have been emotionally accessible to you?
I really do, Blake. So you know, I was about 13 and I tried my first ever gateway drug. It was called Christianity. And they got me into it, right? My school friends got me into it, and I got confirmed in the Church of England, and I would be trying to be a good person and sitting in the pew there. I'm basically feeling like the devil because I could see around the arguments. Plus, also, nobody was as stimulating and as intense as my father. And I could hear my father's mockery sort of in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So I intuited, I got to do something with myself on a very, very basic level here. And I'm not getting this from this sermon. This is just words. Plus, also, it's weird and coercive. And like, I don't want to be part of this weird group thing. And like, what, you want me to come to Louis Palau and I'm going to be evil if I don't do it? Oh, I'm not going to do it, you know? And so, you know, I got the sort of quote unquote low church unpleasantness and the quote unquote high church unpleasantness. And pretty soon afterwards, a few years later, figured out, you know, I need to do some real work on myself. I need to do this thing I've heard of called meditate, because that could be good, you know. My best friend at school as a primary school student was Laura, and she had this huge, massive afro, and we used to go around fighting racists in the playground. We thought it was our job, you know. And her mum was a Maharishi student of transcendental meditation. So I've got to do this, right? So gradually kind of just sort of learned by myself to do it and just get a sort of self-care thing, you know, and gradually started to meet Buddhist people, right? And the interesting thing about the people I met was that they were in Oxford and they were Vajrayana. Now, Vajrayana, again, it's about relating to the basic sort of vomit level of your being. You know, so it was ideal, actually. And it's also about working with the thing called pleasure or the thing called bliss, right? It's like working with the fact that, yes, you do have a body and it's a body which has desire in it. And we're not going to delete this stuff. We're just going to work with this. Although this is good, right? I like this. However spooky and weird and freaky it did get, in way, because I re-encountered this toxic group dynamic sort of everywhere, right? Like once bitten, twice shy, you know, sort of see it. Nevertheless, that, which I started to take really seriously when I moved to Boulder, Colorado, where there was a whole lot of Buddhists in the community started by Trungpa Rinpoche there. I'd met two of them in Oxford, yeah. They'd escaped from that world because the Trungpa Rinpoche's main person had just almost deliberately given people AIDS. Like, you won't get AIDS if you do this mantra. You know, it was really bad.
Oh,
I was
wow.
talking of abusive, really bad. They were like, geez, and they were in the gay community, right? I got accepted into the gay community in Boulder, and these people were incredibly nice to me. So we got to figure out how to live, right? They didn't want to be in their Christian world. My best friend Alan had escaped from Kentucky to join Andy Warhol's factory in the early 80s, and just like, he didn't want anything to do with his family Christian world, right?
Yeah.
Although, of course, you know, when you go to Southeast Asia, you find the same thing happening in so-called Buddhist world, right? Everything, the same problem is the same dynamic. That is also worth knowing, by the way. You know, like this stuff is everywhere,
Right.
which isn't to say that these, what happened to you in particular, specifically to do with Christianity, isn't absolutely horrible and terrible and bad. That's not what I'm doing here.
For sure.
I'm basically like, groups are narcissists and religion like works with that level. And like the Vajrayana is like, so, you know, one of my teachers, I basically jumped ship after this Me Too guy incident. in the Rockies, and I went with the people that my gay friends were into, called Sogni Rinpoche. He's a great teacher. I still consider myself a student of him, and he was talking about, well, what is Vajrayana? You're visualizing these deities and you're doing this mantra, but why? Because you're trying to convince your body to be a Buddhist, right? Like your head has all these ideas like compassion and love and all this stuff, but how do you convince, there's a funny joke that I like. Let me ruin it for you by telling you that it's funny in advance. So there's this guy and he's paranoid that he's being persecuted by a giant chicken, right? And he goes to a sanitarium and he spends months there and he gets cured of the paranoia. But a few weeks later, he comes back in sweating, crying, and the chief psychiatrist is like, wait, what's going on? He's like, the chicken. And the guy's like, but there is no chicken. And the guy says, yeah, but try telling that to the chicken. So a lot of good therapy and a lot of good contemplative religious techniques are about convincing the chicken, you see, AKA the unconscious mind, AKA your brain, AKA your body. Yeah. And so, I need that level. I need that somewhere in my life. I need it to be that, right? And so that was really key. And then I figured out why I needed it later, right? Once I'd gotten a kind of semi-together life together, so I went into therapy with somebody who was in that community, a genius guy called Bob. Hello, Bob, if you're listening to this. Just retired a few years ago and just really helped me, whatever you think about Oedipus or whatever, penis envy, there's a truth in psychoanalysis, right? First of all, it's very non-goal directed. You're not doing outcomes like cognitive behavioral, which was all about ex-gay therapy, really, and that's a horrible outcome if you think about it. But the other thing that's good is that is the truth that you learn, which is that free association is a neurological lubricant, right? Just kind of sitting on someone's chair, just saying, blah, 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 blah. It's happening now, Blake, because you're being so nice and listening to me. It's blah, 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 blah. There's some kind of releasement can happen, and things that you say can affect your body. Yeah. Right? And so once I started to feel a bit better, which took a long time, and involved me going through a marriage that was very difficult for me. Let's just put it this way. Sometimes you have to be shot twice to know that you got shot in the first place, right? So I got this second dose of PTSD, like, oh, wow, I already have an exit wound, which is why I got into this in the first place. And that's why it really hurts, because the wound happened so early in life. I was like, this is just reality. This is just reality now. I don't, right? Anyway, I got to the point where I felt like a bit better about myself. And then I could, then I started opening up, really. But it's only been in the last few years, that I stopped just running. My childhood, my favorite show when I was a kid was The $6 Million Man. It was just starting to go on the air there. And those Steve Austin, a man barely alive. Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology to create.
Has one of the best intros. One of the best intros.
It's superb.
It's so great.
Intro, and I didn't realize until quite recently that I was that guy barely alive, and that I needed the technology of something like therapy and something like Vajrayana to kind of reconstitute me to the point where I could actually start to look around and sort of see my life. Because complex PTSD means you've been injured over and over again, and there was no real escape route, and so that's a thing, right? And it's, I only just figured out not to just dissociate all the time, like this memoir that I wrote was like trying to help people. If it ever gets published, it's like there's like 4 or 5 kind of, I don't have multiple personality disorder, but it's a little bit like that. And these beings, who are actually parts of me, kind of take over in different situations. I'll tell you about one of them. She's female. She's called Tamsin. She's the spitting image of Miss Moneypenny off of the Daniel Craig James Bond films. She's probably based on my best friend Laura from school, and she's a badass, right? And she's standing about 2 feet in front of me and to the right, and she's just looking out for the danger. And when she takes over, other people could die, but it doesn't matter because I have to survive. She's got to get me out of there. Psychologically die. I wouldn't hurt a fly, right? And, for forever, Blake, I had this thing that's only corrected itself recently. I'll get a pair of earpods, right? I'm on an iPhone, so I put the earpods in. Great, I can listen to the music. 2-3 weeks later, the sound's gone in the right ear. But wait, why is the sound gone in the right ear? But, geez, these are really bad. Is it buy another one? And the same thing happens, right? And then eventually going, Apple can't be that bad. So I'm checking, and the balance on my system is exactly centered, right? And then I'm realizing after a while, that they're not malfunctioning. There's perfect sound in here. It's just that I'm so PTSD. I've been thinking like this side of my body, I'm touching the right-hand side of my chest right here, is hollow, right? Like I don't actually live here. I'm sort of pushed up against the left-hand side of my body, and a new pair of headphones will psychologically override it for a little while, but eventually the ingrained feeling that I'm not in here starts to manifest, and then suddenly it's as if my headphones have broken. And
Right.
it's like, this only just started to fix itself, right? Because thank goodness, because I'm paying a lot of money. These things are expensive, dude.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's very interesting to hear. Just one aside. I mean, I actually have a minor form of epilepsy. It's a focal epilepsy, and it only affects the right side of my body. And for a lot of my childhood, my right side, which was the affected side, felt to a degree like less hollow or less solid. It's only been in my, since my 30s that has started to fade, but it's
Wow.
fascinating the ways in which we relate to our own body.
Right on. And it just goes to show you, Blake, that like abusive structures change your brain, right? Which is your body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so when you're kind of unpeeling yourself from that, you really do want to take care of your lovely body. Sometimes, so, whatever this happened to me, in terms of Christianity, and I beg your pardon if anybody feels like, oh, Christianity sucks, but whatever happened to me there last year, I feel like it's the opposite of Gnosticism. Like a lot of Gnosticism is saying we are spiritual beings trapped in a world of matter.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that we're poor, frail, broken, finite physical beings trapped in a universe of terrible ideas, right? Like master, slave, female, male, black, white, masculine, feminine, right? And I think the overarching one here is master versus slave, actually, which is also subject versus object. And these terrible ideas are like, all ideas are like tweets, right? They're like demonic because you can't kill them. They just sort of lie around waiting for somebody to hit retweet. And then all you have to do, like all evil just sort of in it, unquote, is just banality, right? Though my father's world was so banal, it's not even funny. And it was just all about repeating and replaying and whatever, tweeting thoughts and ideas and memes and actions. And just like that, to me, whatever hell could be, could be sort of that, the claustrophobia of being caught in that.
Right. Yeah. And actually, I want to explore that a bit because I think that's the idea that you're hitting on is explored a lot in your book, as far as about us being essentially biological beings, and that is something that has been a focus of a lot of writers and thinkers for a long time. Like embodiment has in the last decade certainly percolated online, and it is definitely a focus of a lot of people that have come out of evangelical backgrounds, places where the body is demonized or inflicted with very particular codes of conduct and value statements and all sorts of things like purity culture, etc. That my listeners will be aware of. But it's also been present. It invokes a bit the same sort of non-dual type thing that's been part of Buddhist thought forever, for maybe not forever, but for a very long time. Even Christian writers like Richard Rohr have popularized that amongst a lot of post-Christians or white Christians or what have you. He's got a very large audience that speaks to that. And then there have absolutely been a lot of queer people writing about the importance of the body, the importance of and people of color writing about the physical effects of things like trauma, which is so much of what we've been talking about. And at the same time, a lot of your writing has also been about environmentalism and even the biosphere, and even the thing that I think is fascinating is it's also about expanding and connecting us back to the non-human too. And I know that's going in a very different direction than what we've talked about so far. But
but in a way, Blake, if I may.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Blake's being very patient with my terrible motor mouth here. But okay, so let's look at it the other way around, right? It's like how human beings treat each other is how they treat the rest of the biosphere that they grew up. And so actually very highest up on my list, is ending white supremacy and patriarchy. Yeah, as the metric for how to achieve a more ecologically just world. And I think that's funny separation between sort of human concerns and whatever one might say non-human concerns, or other words one might use, is a symptom of this issue, right? It's a symptom of a kind of, so for example, it's been said to me, and I've objected vigorously in prose and also emotionally, like animals, unquote, I never like to use this word, animals behave, right? Humans act, right? And it's just sort of like this difference between a slave, which just does things like an algorithm, just behaves, and a person who acts, right? And so all of my work has been about so this white thing that happened to the world, this white European colonialist project, right, which we're still suffering through, one of whose symptoms is this. I'm just going to say it because luckily I'm not a theologian who has to say there are lots of different types of Christianity. I can just sort of say the white European one. Whoa. I'm with Howard Thurman. I think that, Martin Luther King's teacher. Yeah, I think that that one is some kind of sin against the Holy Spirit, if you want to use the technical terminology here, some kind of blasphemy, right? In the form of the Holy Spirit, in the form of so-called, and this is a pejorative term that is used, animism, right? Like the idea that a lot of people who aren't Europeans have in the world that, doors are alive and ducks are also people, right? And kind of thinking my way through so-called Western philosophy, kind of backing out of it into this other world. Funnily enough, there's an overlap here in the way that people use the word deconstruction. Yeah, because actually I am a student of good old Jacques Derrida, and we shared an office at NYU in the early 90s, and he was the first ever professor person to be actually really nice to me, And
wow.
over time, I kind of ungaslighted myself from the default, talking of religion, pardon me, Hegelian Marxism that is the default in that world. I still consider myself very left-wing, but I don't consider myself a member of that church. It's been pointed out to me many times that I'm an apostate who needs to be tortured, and have done radio shows in which this has happened to me. Sort of religion is everywhere, in a funny way. People, and maybe this also sounds funny, but people who say they aren't religious might be more dangerous than people who know that they are,
Yeah.
Talking of very narcissistic exclusion, inclusion structures, then there's nothing like this particular corner of academia that I've been in, right? But deconstruction really kind of resonated with me. And what's interesting about so-called Western philosophy is all you have to do is give it a couple of tiny little tweaks, and suddenly you're in indigenous world, really quickly. You just have to take out a couple of little silly things that don't work. You're just with the rest of the human beings on this planet, right? Since I don't want to appropriate other people's stuff, because it's always seemed to me to be like theft to do that, I'm in the lineage of, you know what deconstruction is? In a funny way, this is another, I don't know if anybody feels like this in the deconstruction that they're doing as Exvangelical people, right? But to me, it's bomb disposal, right? It's wrong to think of deconstruction as taking something apart or dismantling. We've already got good words for that, like taking apart and dismantling.
Yeah.
What we're really doing here is we're disarming something, right? we're cutting the blue wire inside of
Mm.
ourselves and in the system that we happen to be exiting. And in our world, there's no real distinction in some way. And I feel like that's my job, right? I want to go into the really nasty, dangerous idea, and I want to sort of cut the blue wire so that it doesn't hurt people anymore. So, for example,
Right.
I wrote this book called The Ecological Thought, which was explicitly, deliberately using quite right-wing atheist writing by Richard Dawkins, who writes a lot about evolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of cutting the blue wire in there to make it less kind of aggressive, rather than trying to divert. I'm going straight into the poison because of my childhood. I'm like, I have no fear.
Mm-hmm.
One of the superpowers of coming, and this is the hopeful bit, right? One of the superpowers of emerging from an abusive structure is that you have no fear. At some level, you've learned to survive a
Mm-hmm.
very dangerous, where you're being disowned, right? Like I've been disowned by my dad. I've been disowned by my mum. My relation with my brothers is like totally non-existent. I'm sure this has happened to many people who are listening to this. And it's sort of like, you have a superpower.
Mm-hmm.
You have a superpower because you knew the difference between being alive and being a bona fide member of a family.
Mm.
And that doesn't occur to a lot of people. And guess what? Right now, human beings need to learn the difference between being in a so-called family called humans versus everything else, which doesn't really exist.
Mm-hmm.
And is really just kind of white male propaganda. And in a much bigger situation of like, we have solidarity with all the other life forms because we're made out of them.
Right.
And because, and so on and so on. And so like I'll come back to this again, Blake, just to round this out. But like my ecological work has been about pushing that kind of anti-racist, pro-feminist, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic energy into including other life forms
Mm-hmm.
within that rather than despite it, you see. And this is the mission, it seems to me, right? Like if we're going to have planet scale ecological action, it's going to feel a little bit sort of spiritual, mystical,
Yeah.
deep,
Yeah.
because it's connecting to some very primordial things that we've been kind of gaslighted into. Like, I'm not the same thing as a cat.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's the one of the things that I really appreciated about some of your prior work, because you've touched on a couple of things that I want to tease out a little bit more. I really do like your neologisms, the various terms that you use. The one that that I said I would get back to is that you created this term hyperobjects, which you developed this idea. It's part of a philosophy called object-oriented ontology. But it really through that book, you really explored how this applies to something that's very hard to articulate because it's dispersed across time and space in a really massive way. But that is very true with climate change. But what it really helped me with is also looking at something like fundamentalism, of evangelicalism. Like in my context of growing up in Midwest America and being part of the Protestant tradition that had fundamentalist influence, these were things that I and my family and their ancestors were all that they all experienced, that they were subject to, that they learned, and that was really valuable both in understanding something like climate change as well as the other systems, the more human systems of behavior and thought and belief that make these things actually hard to talk about. And they are sort of the same really continuum, I guess. Like the fact that if you can't identify the system, if you can't talk about the system, then you can't critique it. You can't
right on, Blake.
you can't find a new way to examine something in a new way. And that was critical for me, and I was very thankful to come across that first in the
Wow.
Wired book, that Wired article, then in reading the book, because it earlier on, a decade before, when I was still dabbling with academia, my master's thesis was about creation care and evangelical politics. And creation care is this environment, a decades-long movement of environmental thought within Christianity. And there's a lot of wonderful thinkers there in that space. And there's an activist element to it as well. But after I sort of stepped away, or it no longer sort of motivated me at that sort of heart level, the hyperobject was like, oh, I can still engage in this.
Mm.
So
Wow.
I don't actually have a simple way to button that up, but what I think your prior work as well as this book do, and I do want to get to the book and even some of the neologisms there, is that you see how belief and the systems of belief impact the types of actions that are possible too.
Well, Blake, this is actually quite moving for me, because you see, I see my work. My work is consistently, from me, luckily for nobody else, self-help from future Tim. Yeah.
Yeah.
My intellect is the least contaminated part of me, and I'm very fearless in that realm. And so if you think about it, it's like you're writing free associatively. I like to say things that I don't quite understand. I'm trying to understand them later, right? So you basically are putting yourself in a position of writing from the future. Yeah. You're writing from stuff that you don't know yet, right? And on that subject, like a feeling isn't really different from an idea. It's like a feeling is an idea from the future, right? The more heavy of an idea you're trying to develop, the more intense the feeling you're going to have to explore. Like, why else do you go into therapy? Because you're having a feeling that you can't put words on it, right? So I wrote this book, Hyperobjects, about 5 years. I published it about 5 years before I figured all this stuff out about my childhood.
Really?
Right. And when it first hit me that this had happened to me, I was in a bad way, like I was just like, I sat on my sofa for 2 weeks staring at an empty fireplace all day. My friend would come around and take me to this little place in my street called the Rothko Chapel, which isn't really a chapel, nor is it an art exhibition. Who knows what it is, but it's pretty calm in there, That was the one thing in the day. Apart from that, I was just like staring at my phone, like, whoa, this happened, And this little realization started to form of like, wow, Tim, you just published a book about being caught in these huge structures that you can't see, and they're physical, and you can't. And it was as if my unconscious mind was going, hey, pay attention to this idea because it's really relevant to your actual life, above and beyond a heuristic concept that helps us to understand things like the biosphere and global warming without having to get involved in a lot of like concepts and numbers and words. It's great to have a word, right? Like it's like Rumpelstiltskin, right? You've named the guy. It's great to have to name your abuser, right? Like, the demon's name, you can get rid of them, and so hyperobject, like, I get it. It's this high dimensional thing. I don't have to know it all at once. I can't know it all at once. It's okay not to know. I know what it is, but I can't see it, but that's fine, right? Like, it sort of validates people in some way, right? And for me, I find it moving that you would apply this word to a massively distributed, very abusive structure that actually has physical effects on you, right? Like, hyperobjects are physical. They're not just abstract, they're physical, right? Capitalism is a hyperobject insofar as there are millions and millions of people doing millions and millions of capitalist actions every day. Like think about enslaving people. There are millions and millions of people in plantations having to do these movements all the time, right? And so literally having to do these movements, like, I'm not going to read this thing. I'm not going to talk about this thing. I'm not going to text this person. I'm not going to do the purity culture that you mentioned has real consequences for your body, right? And you're sort of wiring your body a certain way as a component in a huge structure, right? That you can't see it, but it's real, right? And you have this almost desperation, like, I know what this is, but I don't even know, right? But when you have Rumpelstiltskin's name, you can put a name on it, and then you can get out of it, right? Because step one of how to get it free from prison is realizing you're in prison, right? Until you figure out you're in prison, you can't get the hell out of there, right?
Yeah.
It's, the situation that we're in right now regarding the fascism, right? Is it how to survive a horror film? Like step one, you're in a horror film. This is a horror movie.
Yeah.
No, nothing you can do except for the really extreme thing is going to work, right? Like Ripley is my hero. I love Ripley because Ripley figures out within minutes of Alien bursting out of John Hurt's stomach that you can't negotiate with this thing. You can't fight this thing. You can't hide from this thing. There's only one thing you have to do. You have to blow him out of the airlock, right? And, you saw people moving towards the previous president with this hope that they could negotiate or stop, or if they got really mad, or if they were really nice. And nothing's going to work, folks. This is narcissistic personality disorder, or as I like to say, alien. Just substitute the picture of Ridley Scott's Alien for the guy, and you've got the guy, right? Like a little baby doing these movements of like trying to grab onto things and trying to suckle is, for most people, cute. So they pick the baby up and the baby imprints and it's all good and they become a little person there. Now imagine that didn't happen and the baby is now 40 years old and is still doing these movements and these lips. Think about the lips. Look at this guy's lips. They look like they're sucking, right? Clue number one. Or Alien, right? Little cute baby is like a few months old. That's cute. If someone's 40 years old and they're still doing that, it's called Ridley Scott's Alien, right? Alien people. You can't negotiate with Alien. Somebody's going to be debating Alien this evening. I can't believe it. The bravery required to even be in the same room as Alien, and I was married for years to a narcissistic personality disorder person. And so figuring out, I lost all my friends and family, but I was fine with that because I have deep survival mode. So I didn't even know that I was stuck until my intellect started saying, hey, Tim, why are you so obsessed with the movie Interstellar? Why are you so obsessed with this guy who's stuck in a black hole trying to talk to his daughter from inside of a black hole? Why do you keep watching it every day? And it was right around that hyperobjects time. And it's the same thing. It's like you're caught in this thing that you can't even name it, right? Once you've got a name, you're on your way out, because you can liberate, the ability. I value highly the emotion of courage, which always makes me feel very moved, and the ability to think straight, right? To like keep your head and just be very clear about stuff in an emergency, because that's what is required. And like what is required in this planet level emergency where we're all being regressed to the age of 2 because it's a huge, big, massive thing. And we're all literally watching big corporations committing crimes on our literal bodies in the form of oil and fossil fuel emissions and all other life forms, right? And it's like, what does this remind you of? The thing that you can't talk about in public, right? The really big hyperobject, which is the sexual abuse thing that's sort of like it's everywhere. I'll say it so then no one else has to. My mum was a social worker, manager person in the end in the 90s, and she would say to her people, if you can see one little tiny flicker of something that is like adjacent to that, it's everywhere in that family because they're letting you see it. But it's totally taboo and illegal. They're going to hide it. You see one tiny little flicker, ding, right? Let me just drop something else into the mix here. The current obsession with so-called innocent children being abused by so-called groomers with so-called sexualized books on the right is the classic pedophile fantasy par excellence. The idea of unspoiled children waiting to be spoiled is the pedophile fantasy that's being projected by the ultra-Christian, ultra-right onto everybody else, right? I'm just going to come out and say it. Because like, why? Because like, that's the thing. That's the problem. We're in this zone right now where there is this horror movie going on. Yeah. And some people are actually arming themselves to kill people like me because I'm a pedophile lizard from space who drinks baby's blood. And even the pastor can't get through to them. Even the evangelical pastor can't get through to some of these guys. So I wrote this book quite deliberately because I live in South Texas to be like, hey, bully, look over here. I'm a privileged white guy in a private school. Stop picking on that librarian. I'm going to give everybody ideas about what the hell this is and how the hell to get the hell out of there. Because I sort of know from my experience as a kid, just intuitively, what this is, right? The environmental collapse giving rise to, and the collapse of just like that idea of master and slave and whiteness all around the world, giving rise to fascism everywhere. And then step two, which is how to disarm that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's not a small that's not a small project to take on.
Just a little tiny
Just
ask.
that's I mean that is the sort of long work that is going to take a very long time to sort of untangle and, as you said, disarm. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah,
do want to,
it's, yeah.
yeah, I do want to take a beat and then actually talk a little bit about your book. I know that we could talk about so many varying things, and there is a lot of stuff that we've talked about that is present in your book. One of the other things that comes to mind is another neologism, which is religios, that you use early in the
Mm,
book, similar to like bellicose or verbose. Instead of
mm-hmm.
religious, you have the term
Oh,
religios, that people have a flavor
mm,
of religiosity, but
mm.
it's not necessarily one that
Oh gosh.
that
I
translates.
would love to talk to that. I
Yeah.
would love to talk to that.
Um, and then that one also has a bit of a companion of sorts in scientism. And I think
Mm-hmm.
just sort of building off what we have already touched on, um, is that these types of group dynamics and the beliefs that accompany them are present. They're not just present in things like evangelical groups. They're also present in different,
Mm-hmm.
even, you know, left-oriented political groups, uh, scholarly groups, that sort of thing. So, what with those two
Mm-hmm.
terms, both religios and scientism, how do those sort of help us really talk about these propensities to have a very particular way of viewing the world? And actually, I'm going to quote one quick line from your book, which was, "Conceptual rigidity is the enemy, ambiguity is how to defeat it," which
Mm.
um, which I think is very insightful. So um, let's talk about those two terms, religios
Right
and
on.
scientism.
Right on. Um, Thank you, Blake. You know, in a way, everything that has been said so far is not just why I wrote the book, but like why to read it, and in a funny way, like how to read it, right? Um, let's think about the people who invaded the Capitol building on the 6th of January, 2021. Those people knew that they were the goody, right? Being a fascist means you know that you are the goody, right? Nancy Pelosi's the baddie. You're the
Yeah,
goody.
yeah, yeah.
You're killing the pedophile lizard from space. You're the goody. You're the goody. That is a functional definition of evil, as far as I'm concerned, is knowing that you're the goody is what evil, unquote, I'm sorry if this is a nasty word for people, feels like. I hope you will agree with me that being a good teacher might feel like you're a bit of a crappy teacher. Yeah, so being a good parent, often you feel like you're a shitty parent, in my experience. Please say yes, somebody in the audience.
Yeah.
And I would argue that being a truly great country involves suspecting that you might be a bit of a rubbish country. And we got the legacy of slavery, and we're going to do something about it, right? We're going to do something. And when you say the long project, that's absolutely right. I'm with Hannah Arendt on this. It's like working with this is now a permanent thing because groups tend to be narcissists, and democracy is a thing you have to work. You have to work it. You have to work at it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So sort of figure out how to find the joy in that, which is perfectly possible, you know, actually. But that's the preface to saying people who the kind of falling for an idea that convinces you that you are the goody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is what's good about the concept of original sin, folks. And again, I'm a weird person.
Would
I came across these ideas way late. You know, so they're like affecting me differently, right? And what's interesting about this concept is that it's like, this is not your fault. This is just a thing, right? It's like structural racism. It's like, this is just a feature of our world. You didn't do it per se, but now that you know what it is, you have a responsibility to do something about it,
Yeah.
right?
That was a very interesting thing to read, just to interject quickly about how you approached original sin, because as someone who, from a different religious tradition, in a way in which it was treated differently, it was it was innate brokenness that is also somehow your fault. Like
Uh,
that's often how it,
mm-hmm,
and and uh there's a
mm-hmm.
lot of people that are like, screw Augustine, like for
For
even
real.
introducing it. And
No,
I mean,
for
he was
real.
very much, he demonized the body, if you want to talk about
Yeah.
that and his legacy.
Right on.
But nonetheless, I mean, to approach it
Yeah.
as more of a structural issue, I mean, I've seen that applied to sin more general, like sin is a systemic or a civil thing. But original sin, I'd never seen it applied to.
Mm. Well, so yeah, I'm this weirdo who's coming to these things a little bit l- later, and I know a little bit what that sounds like. The feeling of being evil. You're right. Like, trust me, like the feeling contaminated,
Mm-hmm.
feeling like nothing I can
Yeah.
do is right, is an abuse symptom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if you've been trained to think that by a religion that you've been in, you've been functionally the equivalent of sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For your early and childhood and your teens, you've been given the conceptual equivalent of having had that done to you. And that might also have been done to you. Right. And so anyone who feels like I'm intrinsically evil, I can't get rid of it, like I'm on the side of that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
I like to think of that. I like this image of angelic demon. Like I'm a demon. But I know that I'm a demon. I'm going to do my best to be nice today and do nice things, as opposed to demonic angel. The real source of trouble in our world is the people who know that they're right, and they apply this rightness in a kind of demonic way, right? And so one way you can do this, of course, and this is what I mean by religiosity. All you need to do to know where I'm coming from, really, is to get a hold of a book called New Seeds of Contemplation by Thomas Merton, right? And there's an essay in there called The Moral Theology of the Devil, in which he outlines very nicely and well that a whole bunch of fundamentalism is actually a form of Satanism, because it is a belief that whoever that is often more powerful than God, and your job is to get rid of that person, is to get rid of evil, right? The
Mm-hmm.
interesting thing about the phrase "deliver us from evil" is it doesn't actually mean, you see, never give a poor boy the operating system, right? I was a poor scholarship boy in a school where they gave me the Greek grammar. Like, I was at the school Milton went to, and the Greek is a neuter noun, toponeron. And evil is neuter noun. The masculine noun, hoponeros, is an evil guy. Deliver us from this evil guy, the evil one, right? That we can get away from
Mm-hmm.
this evil guy. We can defeat the Satan, right? It's often how it's translated. Or herponerio, which is the feminine, which is evil as a substance, right? Evil as a stigma, right? Get this stigma off of me. Get this evil off of me. So much in the world as cruelty has been done um, through these two concepts of evil, right? Like, if you
Mm-hmm.
think evil is that, you can fly a plane into it to get rid of it. You can fly a drone over it to get rid of it. You can torture people until you've gotten rid of it. You've gotten rid of the evil. In the name of good, right? In the name of creating more happiness, people are, digging oil out of the ground, often with the sort of extraordinary reasoning, right? There are these two guys, I like to call them frack boys. They live in Texas, my home state, and they think that since God didn't tell you not to drill in the Arctic, you should drill in the Arctic, right? And you know the logic here, right? And so, but what is actually said in "Deliver Us from Evil" is kind of amazing. I just found out. It's not this transactional, get rid of this bad thing and I'll promise to be nice. It's got nothing to do with that. And it's got nothing to do with get rid of these people or get rid of this thing. It's saying get rid of evil as an adjective, like using the neuter noun there, poneron, is actually an adjective. It's extreme. It's phenomenological evil. It's like, who cares whose fault it is? Who cares who did it? Who cares what it is? It's like, deliver us from orange, deliver us from up, deliver us from then. It's an extreme, like, who cares whose fault it is? Just deliver us from that. It's like an amazing thing to say. because it's actually saying, like this structural thing that we can't get rid of, we're always blaming the other for it, which is functionally evil, right? True conscience is, that you are the evil that you see in the world, right? And you're responsible for that, right? And I will just go ahead and say, if you're feeling toxic and poisoned, another thing to think about, there's only one kind of person who doesn't have any shame, and that person is called a psychopath, right? A little bit of guilt and shame never hurt anybody. A lot of it is incredibly toxic, and believe me, I've spent days and weeks in the fetal position. I did an interview 2 weeks ago from inside of a PTSD episode because I was so freaked out that day. I'm having, you know what I mean? Like all the time, I just sort of like, on a good day, I know what it is and I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Oh Lord, but like religiosity is almost, it's kind of like what we have to put up with in this world, right? People who are certain that they're the good guy, right? Like it doesn't matter how many people you colonize and torture and enslave because you're the good guy. You're doing it in the name of good guy. And, then there's people who suspect they might be the bad guy, and some white people, I would argue, just enough to irritate the religious people. Some white allies there's just enough people, white guys going, wait a minute, I'm the baddie. Oh, we were the baddie. What? And that's why a lot of this is happening, because just a little bit too many white allies of the good stuff. And suddenly, we can't have any of that. Get back in line. Like, why did the guy want to put troops in the street during the George Floyd murder protests, right? I think because there's just enough white people going, this is it. I've had it. And I'm one of those people, right? Like, one of the reasons why I wrote the book was I obviously I haven't been talking explicitly enough about this because this is happening in my world. And I'm an American citizen despite my souvenir accent, and I have a responsibility to up my game and really say something about this, right? So every day, every page, everything that I do has some kind of core of that right now, right? Now let's go to scientism. Scientism, anything can be weaponized. I'm a depressive person, right? Like Jason Bourne can turn a biro into a knife. You can turn any idea you want, including that one, into a weapon that can hurt you. That's what depression is. It's just weaponizing everything in your world and turning it against you.
Yeah.
Right? Anything can be weaponized. So that safety is to know anything can be weaponized, including that idea, right? So science, and this might be important for some people because they might be thinking, I'm out of religion, now I have to get into science. Unfortunately, this might be in the key of, I'm out of this toxic group, now I have to jump into that toxic group. And all of a sudden, you're excluding and including and being aggressive again. And kind of, you're in this group where people are being, it's not really science. It's a kind of religious application of science. And it's everywhere in my world, right? Which is the world of environmental talk. Why do we talk to each other about this stuff in the key of shaking someone by the collar and going, don't you realize, you stupid idiot, your mum just died, you stupid idiot, right? Like, don't you realize there's a huge, big global warming? No. I couldn't be more on the side of the people who are desperately trying to persuade people, right? But there's a problem here, because if we talk in that language, Joe Truck Driver, let's assume Joe Truck Driver is a fundamentalist. Joe Truck Driver, unfortunately, has got I'm sorry, I'm going to say it. It's going to get me in a lot of trouble, but then I'm going to get paid to say the wrong thing. That's why they pay me the medium-sized bucks, everybody. Joe Truck Driver's idea is, oh dear, I'm going to say it, better than the scientific idea, right? Let's think about it this way. My friend Adam McKay did a movie called Don't Look Up, right? And it's about, he created hyperobject industries to make this movie, and it's about a comet that's going to destroy the Earth, and the lamestream media is not covering it. Joe Truck Driver knows that already. Joe Truck Driver knows there's a comet coming to destroy the Earth because he's read the book of Revelation, right? It's the equivalent of, and Joe Truck Driver knows the lamestream media is not going to cover it, but Joe Truck Driver knows something that film doesn't know. I'm so sorry to drop it in here. Ready? Jesus loves him anyway. The stupidest version of Jesus loves you anyway, the nastiest, stupidest version, I'm so sorry to say this, is upper level. because it's about mercy
Mm-hmm.
from revenge. Even if it's just mercy for just white male people, unfortunately, that is upper level. Until people like me talk to that, we're never going to get through to Joe Truck Driver, which means we're never going to persuade America to do this thing, which means China's not going to do it, India's not going to do it, Russia's definitely not going to do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what is required is from people like me is to stop being religious like that and to start being truly spiritual, if that means something to you, like magnetizing people's feelings in a nice way. You can do it, right? Like Martin Luther King, I have a dream, like allowing people to imagine that the future could be different than the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a way that is really non-toxic, because you're allowing people to think straight when you're doing it, right? And that's going to be, like I feel like this is the secret superpower of the current president guy, is that he is Captain Grief, right? Grief is a huge, big meadow with all the emotions in it that you've ever had, right? And it's just bigger experientially than rage. It's just bigger than anger. It's bigger than hate, because it contains hate, but it also contains love and acceptance and kindness and sorrow, and everything else is in this huge, big thing. And he's undergone it for years because his kids have died. If you
Yeah.
can be in that grief place, like during COVID, to talk to everybody so they don't have to go in there completely, that's a powerful place to be. And I will just add here that, I'm deeply influenced by a Douglas shaman called Sabonfu Some. Along with Buddhism, I got into Sabonfu. And before she died in 2017, so one of my very best friends was her assistant. And she's a Douglas shaman. And in that world, everything's about grief. They're like the grief specialists, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that white people don't want to do is grieve. Say, for example, for the legacy of slavery. So, don't make me go in there. The very word woke is a kind of mockery of the fact that they're going to go in there anyway. Like, I'm weirdly cheery about this word because the mockery is at least knowing that you're going to go in there at some point. You're going to cry, no matter how many times you feel like you want to be like, I'm not going to cry, like Antonio Banderas in the
Yeah.
Puss in Boots. You're going to go in there. And you, in her world, if you want to get married, you have a grief ritual. If you have a dispute with your cousin, you have a grief ritual. If you want to put a window on your house, you have a grief ritual. These guys are so busy having grief rituals, they have no time to take over the world. Yeah. And I feel like this is the missing piece. Like, this is the sort of truth and reconciliation thing that I think America needs to go through, and it needs to model it for the rest of the world. Because if anything, that's what America is really. It's a country that doesn't exist yet because of the legacy of slavery, that makes cool things out of nasty, broken European shit.
Yeah. That is that's a nice summary of America in some ways. I mean, it makes me think of there's a Robinson Jeffers poem called "Shine, Perishing Republic," and it captures that. And then, I mean, much more recently, Beyonce and American Requiem seems to really be hitting that note as well. And that's where a lot of our collective pain comes from, is either not grieving or not making space for others to grieve, and just utterly refusing to actually go through it.
But you're quite right to ask me about scientism, because, and I hope I've contextualized it to the point where you can see that fundamentalism with that kind of science, that kind of use of science, is like fighting a dragon with a finger monster. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, yeah. And I know that we're actually coming close to our time, and I do want to be sensitive to that. I do want to actually try as best as we can to button up some of this. There's so much that I would love to continue talking to you about. There's entire elements of the book that that are really structured by your examination of the work of William Blake, and how that um, helped you sort of
Oh,
address Christianity in a very interesting way because he is very heterodox to a lot of
I'm
people.
I'm
Go ahead.
I'm putting my hand up as
Yes,
if in a
yes.
classroom here because I think I know how to make a closing package for people
Yeah,
for this particular show.
sure.
And it has to do with, given that this funny thing happened, Tim, and you consider yourself to be, and I'm describing myself in the most abject, laughable way because I think it's the thing to do. It's a born again Christian. Oh my God! Ah! So given that you are this person, what's that all about, dude? Okay, so I'm married to Trina. That's the other thing that happened last year. I got married to the right person. Trina is Jamaican, and all her family are pastors, right? In
Mm.
this black Pentecostal tradition, which, by the way, yeah, like you look up Noel Jones. I
Hmm.
didn't realize Grace Jones had a brother. Um, anyway, we don't go to church. You can be into JC as far as I'm concerned. I'm a big boy now. I've gone around the mulberry bush of about 5 different things, and I've gone through the therapy. And so Trina won't set foot in a church, right? She's got this Simone Weil. I'm not going in there because why? Because she intuits that it's a toxic group dynamic, right? And while I've been writing hell, she's been writing a book whose title kicks the butt of my title. It's called Things I Hate About the God I Love. Right? She's inside it. She knows the Bible off by heart.
Hmm.
She won a Bible for doing it. Wait a minute, you won a Bible? That was the prize for knowing the Bible? That's a bit sad. You go, what the hell? But she's been in that world. That
Yeah.
world, there's so many people are escaping from that world, and she understands that world way more than I could possibly understand it. But we do come together on on some of these issues, right? And
Hmm.
one of them is we're going to talk and share and be whatever that is, Christian people, without being in a church just for a little bit.
Hmm.
We're going to be in the church of two. What if the guy meant it? Right? What if the actual, like let's be
Yeah.
literalistic in this way. What if he only said, when there's 2 or 3 people, then you're vibing with me, and then drink this thing and eat this thing, and that's it. Maybe that was it. Maybe the whole church thing, in groups of above 3 or 4, maybe that's it kind of goes a bit wrong, or it could go a bit wrong. And the guy's literally saying, well, how about you just get together in a little group
Have
of 2 or 3 people?
Have you read Ada Palmer's speculative fiction?
Wow.
Have
I
you?
wish.
Uh,
I'm a surprisingly ignorant person.
oh no, no. It's and Ada Palmer has a great 4-book series that takes place in like the 24th century or so. And
Wow.
one of the ideas um, in the world building is
Mm,
that essentially churches or group religion is not allowed, but
right on.
there are essentially um, counselor pastor type people that can meet with you one on one to help
Wow.
you tease out your beliefs and
Well, I
ethics.
had no idea. I had no idea.
Um,
But you see, the place to land here is that, I mean, one thing that is particularly sick about the situation that exvangelical people are extricating themselves from is that this is in the name of Jesus, dudes. This is in the name of somebody who is all about being in groups and how toxic they can be,
mhm.
how scapegoating they can be, right? In the name of that guy, you're creating these toxic, aggressive, nasty groups. This is super sick. Get the hell out of there. This has nothing
Yeah.
to do with it, right? Like just intuitively, it's like, this is just wrong, right? But then how do I deal with all this stuff that I've read and I've experienced? And I just want to validate, like, it's okay to be super confused about that. And so me and Trina talk about it all the time, or we write it down, and we've decided it's called live theology. Yeah. So just expect fairly soon some kind of YouTube channel called Live Theology, where me and Trina. The other thing about it is, here's a white guy and a black woman, and the white guy's got this Grand Moff Tarkin, evil colonialist accent, right? And she's Jamaican, right? She's the inverse thing. And here they are talking together, possibly live on stage, possibly just on YouTube, like how to figure stuff out live without knowing stuff in advance, just like feeling your way into it, right? And it's just like, if we can just perform this for people, maybe this would be helpful to model, like, how to do it differently, because she understands intuitively everything I just said.
Hmm.
She could have said in her own way, right? And so it's, if you've exited from this thing just spend some time knowing that was terrible.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to know what happens next. You don't have to have another idea.
Yes.
Ever. Not at all.
That, I think, is where I want to hear you speak a little bit, because I think it does speak to people who may be exvangelical, people who've had bad experiences in religion, but maybe may be open to it in the future or may not. One of the things that I really appreciated about this book is how often you focus on this idea there's no telos, no end goal. Like, it's a very open-ended eschatology, like, or really just does away with eschatology. Just to give a little context to my own experience, one of the more formative undergraduate professors I had was someone that really taught what I can now identify as like Christian Reconstruction, and that's a very toxic type of theology, very prescriptive, extremely only one right answer for everything, and one of the most telling things about being that person's student is the best thing you could get on an essay would be no marks.
So that kind of teacher,
no marks because you actually just repeated what was said. Though horrible. I will say that same teacher helped me learn how to think critically, but taught me how to disagree with him. So I am appreciative of that. However, getting back to the telos part, teleology, destinations, having to get somewhere. If you are brought up if you've got, I will say, another part of the hyperobject book that really vibed with me is it's sort of redeemed in this very interesting way. The fact that the world has already sort of ended, this collective world we have. But now that's this liberating thing. That means you can try any damn thing you want. You can try to make something better. And if that doesn't work, try again. And I see that again in this book when you emphasize there's no destiny, but it all still has meaning.
Yeah, on every level, what is beautiful about life is that it's an accident, right? We've got random genetic mutation. Why do you think you have these ears? Steve Jobs didn't design them. That's really inefficient.
Yeah.
Right? They should be little pinpricks, right? We've got random encounters, aka symbiosis. And we've got random attractiveness, the goal, right? Do you like peacock's feathers? Ooh. When Darwin thought about a peacock's feather, he felt like he was going to throw up because he half intuited, I think, this truth, which is that beauty is totally trans. Yeah. There's no way that evolution would have restricted liking peacock tails to just female peacocks, right? Evolution is super cheap. Male peacocks like them. You like them. Exhibit A, right? And so whatever is beautiful in the world is this completely freely available, going all the way down to flowers, trans phenomenon, right? And so the world is a beautiful accident. It need not have happened that way, right? It could have just been this world of chemicals taking revenge on each other all the time, where one chemical bops another one and absorbs another one. And life, in a funny way, is like chemistry sort of having mercy on itself, right? But I'm going to break it down to a very granular level here, because telos, the thing that has a point, right? One of the things that has a point is I got to tell this other person about Jesus, otherwise they're going to go to hell, which creates this hell situation right there for everybody, right there. So again, never give a poor boy the operating system, right? So I looked it up. Evangelize is a middle voice verb. Euangelis destai, right? Active, it has an object. Passive, it's being done to you. This does not have a subject or an object. Evangelizing is a kind of spiritual Tourette's. You're just going, blah. You're not doing it to anybody. You can't evangelize people, folks. All you can do is go, blah, right? And this whole idea that you've got to do it to someone, or you're in trouble or they're in trouble, is some kind of, no. Like, this is some kind of way in which, Greek, not that one, but like a whole bunch of Greek, like, we are the real people, We invented trigonometry, even though those Babylonians invented it, The original sort of European gangster people, were basically asserting that they have a point to them, right, which is to enslave everybody else, right? And this is a very toxic idea that is, going around, I have noticed in America, somewhere. We've got to create the kingdom of God on now.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, but this is exactly how to create the hell. This is exactly how to make it really miserable for everybody, right? And so just ease up on, and again, if you're just beginning this and you're just feeling a bit like, whoa, what just happened to me? Life without a point is deeply meaningful, right? That's something to know. You don't know why yet. Emotionally, you can't know why, right? But not having a point is, you're not going to die if you're not an arrow that's pointing at something. You can
Mm-hmm.
let go of the arrow quality, completely.
Yeah. Tim, this has been delightful to talk to you about your life, about your work. The book is, and I mean, there's so many ideas crammed into this book that we didn't even touch on, but I'm so thankful to have had this conversation with you. The book is, again, called Hell in Search of a Christian Ecology, and it is available anywhere you buy books. You can find a link to it in the show notes. Is there anything else you'd like to plug here at the end?
I'd like to plug you, Blake. I'd like to say thank you very much for having me. And, thinking is a team sport, right? You can't sort of think on your own, right? And so this is like my lab. And it's also like I'm thinking along with people who are listening to this, because I'm sort of tailoring and sculpting what I say in line with what I'm intuiting about what they might like or need or whatever. And so this is incredibly helpful for me. And so I just wanted to say thank you for listening to this, if you've been listening to this. And thank you, Blake, for having me on. It's a huge honor. I started listening to this show thinking, wow, this is brave. What people are doing here is incredible courage. And this gives me a tremendous, a relatively old guy, he's like 56 years old, some kind of hope for like Americans, like, can figure it out. When it gets broken and wrong, we can still figure out how to move from that space, and that's a beautiful thing. And that's actually something to model to the whole world. And so it may feel terrible right now in your personal life and in your head, but actually you are doing other people on this earth and your fellow Americans a huge, massive favor by going through this. So thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you for sharing your story. I very appreciate it. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Pleasure.